On your mark. Set.
In this episode of Inside Sports, we'll take a look at the Sports Development Foundation. We'll also explore its roles and functions and contribution to the growth of sports in Jamaica. The conversation begins when we return. Welcome back to Inside Sports. I'm your host, Nodley Wright. The Sports Development Foundation commenced operations in 1995. It was established as an independent body to contribute to the development of our nation through sports. With me in studio is General Manager and ex officio Director of the SDF, Denzel Wilkes. Mr. Wilkes has been General Manager for the past 7 years. Welcome to Inside Sports, Sir Denzel.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
First, let me ask you, Sir Denzel, what has it been like being at the SDF?
It's been great. It's been challenging, and it's been exciting at times. It's been 7.75 years.
Almost 8.
And I should also say, don't want anybody to think I'm putting myself in the same category as Jesus, but this is my second coming at the SDF, in that I served there in 2004 as General Manager, left, and then as fate would have it, I'm back there since 2014. So it's been a good experience. You feel as if you are making a contribution. Yes, there are many challenges, but from that perspective, it's good.
How would you compare your two stints at the SDF?
Well, the fact that one has been so much longer than the other, there are tremendous differences. And of course, the changes that have taken place over time, in the sense that in 2004, it was a completely different situation in terms of the economics, in terms of the focus. Most importantly, at that time, we probably had less than 20 national sporting organizations trying to assist. Now we are way up closer to 60. And so that represents fundamental changes in terms of how we have to, as the young people nowadays say, pivot.
Right. So I think you went in the direction that I wanted to go into. What are the roles and functions of the SDF?
Fundamentally, infrastructure, sporting infrastructure, developing that as much as is possible, and secondly, assisting in the operations of the national sporting organizations. Those are the two key things, and of course in carrying out those functions you get into many other areas. You get into research, you get into all kinds of things that just support those two areas, but those are the two main areas of responsibility.
Right, I know the demands on the SDF would have been great. When you compare the time that you started to now, what are some of the improvements that you have made?
I think we continue to develop the efficiency with which we are able to execute infrastructure projects. And the whole matter of what we have to go through, we are a government entity, and procurement is a critical thing as far as that is concerned. And that's an area in which you have to be continuously learning. The fact that we have been able to negotiate that particular space with so much success and with so little challenges as far as not following the regulations and that sort of thing, that's a major achievement for us, in spite of the significant infrastructure projects that we have had to execute. And because once you're doing that, it means you have to get into the depths of procurement, and you have to make sure you travel along the path which allows for transparency. And so that is one area in which I think we have developed a level of efficiency. Our communication is much greater now with the national associations, and so we are much better able to assist in the various areas. Then there is the whole question of our collaboration with various entities, which we are able to do in a much more efficient way now as we go along.
Right. It's been 25 years since the SDF has been in existence.
Yes.
How has its involvement in sports changed? And if it has, what ways?
It hasn't changed. I would say it has grown, as I mentioned before. In 1995, when we started with just 11 sporting bodies. We now have as many as 60. I say 60 because there are 60 that you could say are registered with us. Those to whom we provide regular assistance in the form of a subsistence is more in the vicinity of 40. But there are many others which we assist from time to time based on specific circumstances, and the fact that we may not be assisting them as far as subvention is concerned is simply because of incapacity in terms of just not having enough money to go around. But I would say those are the two areas in which we have been able to make an impact.
Right. How does the SDF receive monies to carry out its mandate?
That's an interesting one. At the start, and let me just say here, one of the reasons why possibly we have been able to operate with the level of efficiency is because we haven't lost too many members of our staff. So you do have quite a few members of staff there now who have been around almost for the entire 25 years. And that has allowed for that knowledge to come forward and to be always there in the transformation process that is perpetually taking place. The Chase Fund was established around about 2004. But if we go back to 1995, when the foundation was established, the determination was that the proceeds from gaming, the taxes, especially dedicated tax from gaming, is what would be utilized for sports in particular. And between 1995 and 2004, all the funds that came as a special tax on gaming was dedicated to just sports. In the early 2000s, a decision was taken to bring in other areas that it was felt were in need of additional funding, and so it got to the stage where sports was then receiving just 40% of the take from the taxes. Of course, over that time, gaming grew, and so yes, the total amount that was available grew, but there is no question that the SDF would have been negatively impacted in terms of all that's available to it. But nonetheless, Chase came into being, and in that context, we started receiving our funds through the Chase Fund. In 2017, however, there became a new development where some of the laws regarding the whole matter of gaming were changed, and so funding from the gaming industry, it was determined that that would go directly to the consolidated fund. That, however, has not really changed how we receive our funds, in that while it goes to the consolidated fund, it comes back to us through Chase just the same.
Okay, so that hasn't really affected you. But one of the things I noticed you spoke about was infrastructure, and that's a key part of what you do. But how else do sporting organizations benefit from the SDF? Well,
we in fact provide a monthly subvention to approximately 40 national sporting bodies, and that's significant. And in fact, throughout this pandemic, which really hit us about March 2020, the fact that the powers that be made a decision, in fact the minister in particular decided that we would not cut the subvention to the national sporting bodies, has proven to be a lifeblood for them, because if that had taken place, then sports would probably be really now trying to just begin to rebuild. So that kept a lot of them going. So that support is critical. But in addition to that, whenever they're going to get into competitions, when they're going to compete overseas, they are also able to make special requests for assistance, whether it is with the transportation expenses and all that is involved in competing. They are able to request from us funds, and at that time things are assessed based on the capacity of the organization and the nature of the request. So we are providing regular subvention and special accommodation based on the circumstances.
That sounds good. So you give them money, but what do they give you in return? In other words, what qualifies them to receive these funds?
Right. Well, it begins at the level where we assess whether or not the foundation will accept the national sporting body as an entity worthy of its support. So they do have to apply for recognition from the SDF. That involves, at the most fundamental level, ensuring that their sport is part of what is known as sport accord. In other words, there has to be a recognition of the sport at an international level. We have had to look at that, re-examine that. Once upon a time we could use just the International Olympic Committee, but now we have gone further because there are so many sports that have just come up on the horizon, and so we have to go through now. Then we have to ensure that they have a proper structure that allows for a reasonable level of administration. We have to ensure that they're affiliated to an international body, and we have to also ensure that efforts are being made to propagate the sport nationally. That is absolutely critical, because once you say you're operating a sport, we don't want that to be just theoretical and to be confined to just one or two persons. We want to make sure that the sport is genuinely being played and is redounding to the benefit of those who should participate.
You spoke about administration, but you didn't speak about a proper accounting and doing the books. Why did you leave that out?
Administration is a
covers that
term that under which proper accounting comes under.
Okay.
Having been acknowledged by the Sports Development Foundation and being taken on board, whether it's just to receive funds on request or to get a subvention, there's a basic requirement that they must report on a regular basis. And when we say regular, it involves, first of all, they must provide us with quarterly reports as to what they're doing with the funds. They must provide annual reports. Through the years, in many instances, it was a case where only if you were receiving funds above a certain level, you were required to provide audited financial statements. In more recent years, we have taken things up a notch, and all sporting bodies are now required to provide audited financial statements so that there is probity as to exactly how they are performing. We are also regularly monitoring their elections, how they change leadership, that sort of thing, and the level of their activity. They have to provide that on a regular basis to us. So there is accountability where that is concerned.
Okay, but oftentimes we hear the issues about major sports getting much more funding than other sports who according to them, need it. How do you rationalize providing more financial support to one sport as opposed to another?
That's a very difficult one, and I make no bones about the fact that it's not easy to make that determination. Over time, we have had the benefit of research which will indicate at a basic level what's the cost of operating this particular sport, to what level is the particular sport operating. And let me use the example at one extreme. If we use the football example, football, whether we like it or not, is the most popular sport in Jamaica.
Right.
Played by more people than any other sport, unless you bring probably dominoes into the business where everybody who plays football plays dominoes. So
right.
Maybe that way. But that costs. So a federation that's responsible for football has responsibility across all parishes and a whole lot of responsibility at the international and at the regional level. At any one point in time, you would have a number of national teams, age group, and at the senior level, preparing for various competitions, and you also have responsibility for developing the sport from a grassroots level. So immediately you recognize, because of the spread of the sport, it's going to cost some more. Track and field is another example at that kind of a level, and you use that to give you a gauge. That's not the final determinant, but it gives you some gauge as to what the cost is. Then you may have a sport like Seido Karate, which is a relatively small sport in terms of its level of participation and that sort of thing, but has a level of importance. And so, as I said, I was going from one extreme to the other, and not by any means belittling a sport, but just in terms of its breadth. And along the way, you have all the others. You'll have netball, you'll have your gymnastics and that sort of thing. And we also look at the operations of other sporting entities like ours across the world, so that we don't try to reinvent the wheel. We are looking at how the British try to do their thing, how they get funding, how they administer the funding. And in many instances, we find that they do use a model which involves performance-based funding. So you get a sport that does very well. One, it is going across, it is in the schools. In our case, it's schools where we play most of our sports. That's the base. And they are also doing well when they get onto the international scene. And so you say, oh, we have to pay some attention here. Performance is to be rewarded. But you can't use that alone, because you'll get what we refer to sometimes as the chicken and egg situation. So those are the things that we are constantly battling with and trying to resolve. It is never at an end where you say, okay, this is it, that is it. Trying to make the adjustments, trying to be as transparent and as fair as possible, but it's a work in progress.
Thanks much, Sir Denzel. We take a quick break, more when we return. Welcome back to Inside Sports. I'm your host, Nodley Wright. With me in studio is General Manager of SDF, Denzel Wilk. In this segment, we speak specifically to the development of sporting facilities. Sir Denzel, just before we touch back on the sporting facilities, I wanted to follow up on something you spoke about. Sports that deliver more and in terms of participation. But what about some of those sports that should be able to fund themselves independently based on ability to attract sponsorship, crowd support, and that kind of a thing? What role does that play in deciding how much is given?
It does play a role. Glad you raised that, because we are in constant discussions with each sporting body, encouraging them to develop methods of raising funds. They know very well that we can't afford to provide them with all that is required.
Right.
And part of their responsibility is to be able to generate funding. So from time to time, we will have discussions and even seminars, if you will, which speak to the issue of fundraising, which speak to the issue of good governance in terms of the most efficient use of the funds that are available. And we even speak to things like, we will discuss with them how best to approach the private sector. We will remind them of the fact that the private sector is not government. It doesn't provide funds just like that. The private sector wants, with the common term is what, bang for the buck.
Right.
So that they have to show the corporate entities that it is worthwhile to support their sport by ensuring that their sport is out there. And with the advent of technology, the opportunities are much greater. Then there is the side of things which one has to be very careful with. But there are some sports for which the parents in particular are a little better able to provide a level of support. And in its tradition, you do have a situation where parents are used to assisting with the airfares because they want to ensure. Swimming is one, for example, which is a big sport, but does have quite a bit of that in terms of parents coming in, whether they are involved at the corporate level or at the individual level. A sport like chess is another one of those. The equestrian thing is another one of those. There's bridge, which is another sport, which you get a little bit more of that than you will get for those sports like your football and your cricket and that sort of thing. And this is not to suggest that you don't have parental support in these other sports, but you do know that that is how sports has manifested itself through the years. And we utilize that as much as possible with the whole issue of communication and collaboration. And that helps to make the determination as to what could be managed.
Is there a weaning process?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we try to be as reasonable as possible, but at times we have to be a little tough, as they say, to say, well, look, you just can't get any more until you show certain things. What we look at is strength of administration. That's absolutely critical. And where we see that slipping, we really try to make it clear that if you don't show up, because of course the foundation has no authority over a sporting body. So you can't simply say do this, do that, whatever. But we have to make it clear that if you are not operating at a certain level, we have a responsibility for taxpayers' monies. We are not a private entity, and so we must be transparent, and we must be able to convince the taxpayers that it is worthwhile spending on this particular area.
I know we spoke about disbursements of funds earlier. Is there a limit on how much funds can be dispersed to a particular sporting body?
Well, absolutely there is a limit, because there is a limit in terms of the funds available to the Sports Development Foundation. I can tell you off the cuff that over time, in recent years, what we have received in terms of our total budget hovers somewhere between, say, 500 and a little over $600 million. Now, in any year, that has to be spread across infrastructure, spread to the national sporting bodies, cover the costs of their various operations which they will apply for from time to time, take care of the administrative expenses of our entity and all else that's involved. So that immediately puts a cap on what you can manage. And within that now, we go through the exercise of trying to say, okay, so football needs this, but this is what they can get. So gymnastics needs this, but this is what they can get. And the same thing for tennis and for table tennis and all the rest of things. So yes, there is that, but there is no rule which says you can only get this amount. It is all related to the limitations of the overall cake. Okay.
This follow-up should have come a little bit earlier, but I'll put it here now. Say I head a sporting organization that wants to develop a facility, and someone else has an organization and they want to host a sporting event. Is there a difference in the procedure or how it is that your approach to seek funding?
Okay, well, let's take the hosting of a sporting event, and you're talking about locally, regionally, or even internationally?
Both.
Okay. Once there's the hosting of a sporting event that goes beyond just the national, in other words, it involves overseas. It moves kind of outside of the realm of the Sports Development Foundation, in that you now must apply to the ministry to get the permission to host, and in fact, in the ideal circumstances, the ministry requires that they get notification as much as 2 years ahead, because the ministry also will now have to speak with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in some instances the Ministry of National Security. All of those things have to come together if you're going to host a regional or international event. And so you have that involved. In the midst of that, of course, there will be an indication, a request to the Sports Development Foundation as to how much can you afford. And then we will get into discussions with them, say, okay, how much is your international body contributing, or how much is your regional body contributing towards this thing? Is it something that can generate funds from the activity? How will that be? So there's just a myriad of things that you have to get into, and so that's what usually comes out in discussions in what is usually called an LOC, a local organizing committee, and that goes beyond the SDF because of all the various factors that have to be involved. But again, it's advocacy. Again, it's based on limitation. Again, it's based on whether or not you have the facility, which is in keeping with international best practices and all that goes, for example, the National Stadium, there's a lighting situation. There's going to be somebody from an international body which comes down and check the quality of your lights and say, well, yes, there's going to be somebody who looks at your playing area.
Yes, there's a surface issue there too.
Absolutely, there's a surface issue. So all of these things go into that. The other aspect that I want to mention is that we are always going to say to them, so do you have a sponsor? Have you been talking to the corporate community? Is there a sponsor that sees beach volleyball as being so attractive that they would be willing to come on board? If it's a big thing, is there an international sponsor? Is there a Puma? Is there a Nike? Is there, involved in the particular thing? And of course, Jamaica has a history of staging many events. I mean, we go way back to the Commonwealth Games, the CAC Games. We have done Carifta a couple of times, and we have done a number of other things, even qualification matches for football and that sort of thing. So we do have some experience, but in those instances, we spread a little wider than just the foundation. Thank you very much,
Sir Denzel. That's a good note, a positive note on which to end. And I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this episode. A special thanks to Mr. Denzel Wilkes, General Manager and ex officio of the SDF. Great talking to you, and all the best going forward.
My pleasure.